Coming up, after Nigel Farage's recent admission that Brexit has failed,
So the failure of Brexit is to be laid fairly and squarely at the door of the Conservative government.
self-styled Brexit Hard Man Steve Baker has now had his come-to-Jesus moment. The former Tory Brexit minister, who was one of the leading voices of the Leave campaign, has now said something absolutely astonishing. He suggests that the Brexit referendum should have required a supermajority of 60% to pass. Yep, you heard that right. The very same guy who championed the take back control and sovereignty isn't it slogans is now questioning the whole basis of the Brexit vote. But, as you'd expect from a Brexit Cult member, everything is not quite as straightforward as it would first appear. It seems there could well be a hidden motive behind what seems to be Baker's quite shocking admission. Stay tuned. I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, subscribe, and above all, share a link to this video with your social media contacts. Now, to give you a bit of context, Steve Baker made these comments while discussing the idea of an Irish unification vote earlier this week. For those viewers not familiar with the concept of Irish unification, it's the idea that the 6 counties that comprise Northern Ireland would leave the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and unify politically with the Republic of Ireland within the European Union. The self-reputed hard man of Brexit, now the government's Northern Ireland minister, suggested that a simple 50% plus 1 majority would be inadequate for such a monumental decision. Given the political complexities and the divisions that something like unification could cause, his argument may seem to have some merit at face value. But the demographic background seems to suggest an inexorable shift towards eventual Irish unification. Traditionally, Northern Ireland has had a Protestant majority that aligned more closely with the United Kingdom. But in recent years, Catholic communities, who are generally more likely to favour Irish unity, have been growing at a faster rate and now form 42.3% of the population of Northern Ireland compared to the 30.5% who self-identify as Protestant. Not just that, but younger generations in Northern Ireland, regardless of religious background, appear more open to the concept of a united Ireland, partly due to economic and social factors, including Brexit itself, which has played a crucial role. The complicated border issues and trade disruptions have led to many in the 6 counties to reconsider the benefits of remaining part of the UK. These demographic and political changes continue to tilt the scales ever more in favour of those advocating for Irish unification. I would argue that a simple majority of more than 50% would be adequate for any future Irish unification vote because the inexorable demographic trends are clearly showing the tide of history. The truth about why Hardman Steve is really pushing for a supermajority of 60% in any Irish unification vote lies in the full title of the political party of which he is a member, the Conservative and Unionist Party. The Unionist part emphasises his party's commitment to maintaining the political union between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which makes it a bit more unbelievable that, now that Brexit has happened, he is ironically now in favour of supermajorities being required for massive constitutional changes. Back in 2016, the UK voted to leave the EU with a 52-48 majority. It was extremely close, with the Leave campaign subsequently being fined for breaking electoral rules on spending. Yet that narrow victory set the UK on a path that has resulted in years of political turmoil, economic damage, and a huge amount of polarisation amongst the British public. Brexit hard man Steve Baker himself claimed that the lack of a higher voting threshold meant many people, politicians included, refused to accept the result, causing, in his words, serious political trouble. Questioned about the Brexit vote, he had this to say. One regret is it probably should have been a supermajority. That's a huge thing for me to say, because if it had been a supermajority, we'd have lost and we'd still be in. But the reason I say that is if we'd had to have 60%, everybody would have abided by the result. If it had been a 60-40 result, it's inconceivable to me that we would have had all of the political difficulty which followed from members of Parliament in particular refusing to accept the result. Now, of course, the phrase refusing to accept the result is very much a right-wing talking point. In truth, I don't know of any parliamentarians who refused to accept the result. Debated the result, yes. Opposed particular iterations of the withdrawal agreement, for sure. I mean, the House of Commons is actually a debating chamber, and even the leading lights of the Leave campaign didn't have a clue what Brexit actually meant. They were still getting over the unexpected shock of winning the advisory referendum. How can you be said to refuse to accept the result when nobody from the Leave campaign could actually explain what the result that you were asked to accept actually meant? Remember Theresa May's ludicrous and nonsensical Brexit means Brexit, and her even more meaningless red, white and blue Brexit, which of course just happened to also be the colours of the Russian flag, from where a lot of the Leave campaign's funding can ultimately be traced. There's no doubt whatsoever that Vladimir Putin was a huge supporter of the Leave campaign, with many commentators in Europe suggesting that Brexit and the subsequent fracturing of European unity may have been a consideration for Putin in his decision to invade Ukraine. But back to Hard Man Steve. I think I know what's behind his ludicrous admission of regret that the vote to leave the European Union should have required a supermajority. To me, the clue to his deceit lies coincidentally in the Northern Ireland question. Much like the demographic trend towards an overwhelming majority favouring Irish unification, Steve Baker is fully aware of a similar demographic trend towards Britain rejoining the European Union. He knows that Brexit voters were disproportionately from the older voting groups, with 73% of voters under the age of 24 voting for Remain. And new voters attaining the age of 18 since that second advisory referendum in 2016 skew 85 to 15% in favour of rejoining, according to YouGov polling. Although 1 in 3 Brexit voters have subsequently changed their minds, it's the demographic change that is admittedly the larger factor in the phenomenal shift in attitudes towards Brexit, with the British public now astoundingly trusting the EU government more than the UK government by 25 to 24%, according to YouGov's Brexit tracker data and as reported in The Guardian. The proof of this is the consistency of poll tracker trends like this one, showing increasing numbers of voters believing it was wrong to leave the EU. And this one, showing a growing majority now wishing to rejoin the EU. And if you look closer at this majority to rejoin tracker, it currently stands at 58%, excluding don't knows. Is it a coincidence that Brexit Hard Man Steve Baker is only now suggesting a supermajority of at least 60% should decide future referenda on matters of massive constitutional change? After 13 years of suffering under this dishonest Tory government, I think you and I know better. When he claims to regret not pushing for a 60% majority in the second advisory referendum to leave the EU, he's not just having a come to Jesus moment. No, he's thinking about the demographic pressure for a referendum on applying to rejoin the EU, perhaps as soon as the first term of a new Labour government. And this is the beginning of the Brexit cult's resistance against opposition to their overwhelmingly unpopular Brexit, making the threshold for rejoining higher. We see you, Brexit Hard Man Steve Baker, and we also see you admitting, indirectly, to all the mayhem that the entire Brexit process has caused. You admit that if the threshold had been 60%, Brexit would not have happened and we'd still be in the EU. But according to you, at least everyone would have abided by the result, thus avoiding the immense political difficulty that followed. And for you, Brexit Hard Man Steve Baker, to say this, that is a huge thing. Sure, you think you're stealing a march on setting a higher threshold for a future referendum, calling for the UK to reapply for EU membership, but at the same time, let's not lose sight of the fact that this grand wizard of the Brexit clan is admitting to the perils of a government abdicating their constitutional duty to make a decision on behalf of their constituents, and instead putting an ill-defined and complex issue to a poorly informed electorate and asking them for a simple yes-no response to a complex issue. I'm sorry if any viewers have found the repeated use of the nickname Brexit Hard Man Steve Baker to be a bit annoying, but you should be aware of the context. That he has also apologised for his self-confessed ferocious stance during the Brexit negotiations with the EU, which he admits did not always encourage Ireland to trust the UK government. Forget the tiny margin of victory as a cause of Brexit ructions. Brexit hardman Steve Baker himself was the cause of many of these ructions, issues and the problems in arriving at the eventual withdrawal agreement, and the related hard Brexit the nation is now suffering. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Please feel free to leave a comment below to persuade other viewers that I've been maybe unfair to Steve Baker, or to try to argue that Brexit hasn't happened yet, or that there's an establishment conspiracy to ensure its failure, or that there was no moon landing. But do give the video a like or subscribe to the channel.